Today, we're going to be looking at the topic of baptism. We'll look at it from a biblical perspective, and we'll understand why it is, hopefully at the end, the Marthoma Church practices baptism the way that it does. You know, in our church that we oftentimes do infant baptism, but our Marthoma Church also does adult baptism. We do adult baptism in the case of adult converts and infant baptism in the case of young ones who are born into Christian families. So why is it that we do this practice in this way? We know that from the New Testament, Jesus instructs his disciples to go and baptize. And then he specifically says, or at least what we have recorded in the book of Matthew, is the Christian baptism is a baptism in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And this idea of baptism, though it seems to appear just in the New Testament, it's actually based on an idea that's much older and that's found in the Old Testament. For example, I think we all know how the act of communion is a parallel to the act of the Passover in the Old Testament. That idea that the Old Testament Passover is a foreshadowing of, and it is very clearly linked to the idea of communion, that is a well-established and clear link for us. What might not be as clear is the connection between circumcision and baptism. And so in order for us to understand why the Marthoma Church does baptism the way that it does, we need to understand and ask the question, why does God institute circumcision? Who is it for? How is it administered? And what does it mean? So this is very important for us. So let's go and look at, and hopefully you have your Bibles with you, in Genesis chapter 12, the very familiar passage. And there we know that God makes a covenant with Abraham. This is a covenant to bless him. And not only that, it was a covenant that said that Abraham would be a blessing. Now, even though a covenant has been made, in new modern times like the ones that we have now, if you're going to make a deal with someone, if you're going to buy a house, it's not enough to just say, let's agree on this transaction. You need some way of formalizing that transaction, some way of making it official. In our modern times, we have a contract that we sign, and our signatures at the end of this document show that we fully understand what's happening and it is official. If anyone asks, we can show this contract. We can appeal to this legal document as proof that we are part of this transaction and we agree to it. In the Old Testament times, how did they do it though? In the Old Testament times, when God makes this sort of an agreement with his people, it is backed up with a covenant. It is backed up with a formalized process. Now, this word covenant, we hardly ever use this word in today's language. It shows up mostly in the context of marriage, when a husband and wife make a covenant with each other. And that covenant that a husband and wife makes, it doesn't include, the Western form of the engagement. In our circles, the wedding is what makes it official. The public declaration, that ceremony, that official moment is what lets everyone know, and it's what lets these two people know that they are going to be in a lifelong committed partnership with one another. We don't see that in Genesis chapter 12. We only hear about the promise. It isn't until Genesis chapter 15 that we get the official contract being played out. And so we need to go back and read some verses here so that we can get it into our mind. If you just look in Genesis chapter 15 And I'll start from verse 7 to 11. That is the setting up of this contract, getting all of the materials required for this legal transaction. But then it actually takes place in verses 12 through 17. So let's start with verse 7, Genesis 15, verse 7. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Basically asking, what is the legal, what is the official proof? And he said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down to the carcass, Abram drove them away. So let's set up what's happening here, because this is a very ancient context and we're not used to grabbing animals and cutting them into pieces to form a legal contract. In the olden days, when you had two parties coming together, they would take an animal and they would cut it in two. And then the two parties of the agreement would walk between the pieces of the cut animal, and they'll say something like this: if I violate the terms of this agreement, may I be like this animal. Basically, may I be killed. Okay? That is the severe consequence for breaking and violating this agreement that we both have. Normally, two people making an agreement, say, for example, I agree with my neighbor that this is the boundary line. Let us establish this agreement in official terms. We take an animal, we cut it in two, we walk between the pieces, and we say this. Okay, done. The other people around us have seen this transaction take place. But it's not always the case that both parties walk between the pieces. What, for example, would be the situation if you have a landlord and a peasant? One landlord owns all of this land, and he makes an agreement with a peasant saying, I will allow you to farm here, but you must give me, X% of whatever it is that you grow. Now, in that sort of a situation, both people do not walk between the cut pieces. The landlord, being the more powerful one in that situation, he will make the peasant walk between the pieces by himself. So what that means is, if the peasant breaks the contract, he will receive the consequence. But the landlord, the higher up person, is somehow free from those kinds of consequences. And that's normally how it's done if you have an imbalance of power. Now, with that in mind, let's continue reading. In verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there. They shall be oppressed for 400 years. This is referring to the time when they're in Egypt. But I will bring judgment on the nation they will serve, and afterward they will come out of with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, and you shall be buried at a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet complete. Now, verse 17. When the sun had gone down, it was dark. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between those pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants, I give this land. So the smoking pot and the flaming torch, those are symbols or representations of God. Who goes between the cut pieces? It's not Abraham. It is only God. And so here in the very beginning, you get the clearest expression of God's unilateral grace, of how he establishes a covenant. And even though he is the greater party, he does not make Abram go through the pieces by himself. In fact, he alone, God alone, goes through the cut pieces. And just imagine for a moment, or think for the moment of the theological significance of this. Who is punished when the terms of this violation are broken? It's not Abram. It's going to be God. And we see that foreshadowed on the cross. The very fact that when human beings break this covenant, God bears the weight of the consequences on the cross. And he saves Abram and his descendants through this act of taking on the consequences himself. And so this is the gospel message all the way in Genesis chapter 15. But we may not have read it in that way. So this is the beginnings, or this is the officializing of this covenant that God made with Abram. And it's very important that we recognize who is involved in this. Was Abram there? Yes, he was there. Did he have to go and get the animals? Yes, he's the one who got the animals and cut them in two. But who went between the pieces? Who takes the sole responsibility? Who initiates the covenant and then officializes the covenant? It's all God. On that side, it's all God. Now, this is the covenant that has been made. After that, you need some sort of a sign or a marker that reminds you that this covenant has been made. And in the Old Testament, that sign was circumcision. Circumcision is this physical process, or this physical act that the men would do, and it would be a forever reminder to them that God had made this covenant with Abraham and with all of his descendants. When does Abraham receive this sign? He doesn't receive it before he expresses faith. In fact, the Bible is very clear that he receives this sign after he expresses faith. So for that, we can just turn to Romans chapter 4, verses 10 to 11. Romans chapter 4, verse 10 to 11 goes like this. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. So faith, or the righteousness that he received, was given to him before he was circumcised. This is the basis for adult baptism. This is why it makes sense for a new believer who is coming to the faith that they would first express faith, be considered as righteous by God, and then be given the privilege of bearing the mark of this covenant that God has initiated. So that's how it starts, but that's not how it continues. If you read further on, we see that God will go on to say that he would want this sign to be given to all of the descendants starting at day 8. When a child is 8 days old, you give them this sign. Now, why does God want a little infant who has no clue about the covenant with Abraham and God, who doesn't understand, anything in this world? Why should they receive this sign on them? Well, so if we turn just further down in Romans chapter 4, so Romans chapter 4, verse 16, it goes like this. For this reason, it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants. The idea is this, that when the circumcision is given to an infant, what is being emphasized is that the promise rests on grace. In order that the promise may rest on grace is how Paul words it. So salvation rests on grace. Faith does not achieve salvation. Faith does not achieve salvation. Faith only receives salvation. That is extremely important for us to understand, because in the Western world, where we've made everything about what I do, we've made faith to be something that somehow achieves salvation. And that's why there becomes an overemphasis on certain actions within certain parts of Western Christendom. So God is the one who establishes a covenant. Abraham believes in God, and the sign of this circumcision is now given as a testimony of God's graciousness. That order, extremely important. After that, this is why it makes sense that this sign is given to all of the infants, and not only the infants, anyone in that household, anyone and everyone in that household should, or at least the males, should receive this sign. Now, before we say, that doesn't sound very spiritual, shouldn't each one of these people believe? Well, the idea is that we're not talking about individual capacity to believe yet. We're talking about a community that affirms God's capacity to start a covenant relationship with his people. And moreover, this idea of a covenant head, that is a person who is in charge, and through that person, we receive the blessings. Before we criticize that model, let us recognize that we are all recipients of that model, because Christ is our covenant head. Because of his goodness, we are receiving the grace and mercy of God. If we go and say, well, why don't all of those infants express their faith first? Then the same question can be made to us as Christians. Why can't we be perfect first? Why do we need a covenant head? Why does that infant need a covenant head? It's because of our imperfections. It's precisely because we're not capable of it on our own that we require a covenant head. Moving forward, those people who are on the adult baptism side, and let's quickly just map out all of Christianity so you can see the proportions of this. Christianity can be broken up into 2 and maybe 3 major divisions. You have the Western Church, the Eastern Church, and then perhaps we could say the Syrian Church, which is like this Oriental church. These 3 branches, the Eastern Church and the Syrian Church, from the beginning till now, we have been practicing infant baptism. In the Western world, half of them are, we can just say one branch is Catholic and one branch is Protestant. The Catholic side does infant baptism. Within the Protestant wing, you can break it into 2 branches. And so on one side, you have the Lutherans, the Reformed Church, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Methodists. They all do infant baptism. Who does adult baptism only? It is a very small group of Christianity. And it starts with the Anabaptists. That group branches off into the Baptist Church, the Church of Christ, Pentecostal Church, and then various non-denominational types or evangelical churches. This is a small subsect of all of Christianity. We live in a part of the world that has a heavy influence from that small group. And so we might think and hear a lot of people talking about how adult baptism is the only right way. But let's understand it in context. For thousands of years, the vast majority of Christianity has been reading the Bible the same way and coming with the same understanding that infant baptism based on circumcision makes sense. Now, we haven't made yet the connection between circumcision to baptism. So let's make that connection now. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29 goes like this. So Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 to 12 goes like this. In him also you were circumcised with a spiritual circumcision, by putting off of the body of the flesh in the circumcision of Christ. When you were buried with him in baptism, you were also raised with him through faith in the power of God who raised him from the dead. But what is Paul saying here? In Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Paul is making a bridge between the idea of the Old Testament practice of circumcision to the idea of the New Testament practice of baptism. There is a common complaint that comes from the adult baptism camp that says that, well, circumcision is just an external action given to a physical lineage, but baptism is a spiritual action given to a spiritual lineage. Before we get too caught up in how nice that sounds, let's recognize and go back and reread the Old Testament to understand that no, from the very beginning, circumcision was always meant to be understood as a spiritual act. And so you see that here in Colossians chapter 2, in him you were also circumcised with a spiritual circumcision. And we don't have time to get into it, but there are several passages in Deuteronomy and even in Jeremiah where God says, well, in the context of circumcision, he says, circumcise your hearts. That is, there needs to be a removing of the old flesh, right? And so that the newness of God can come forth in our lives through by way of our hearts. It was always meant to be a spiritual act. And so when we look at it, the connection from circumcision to baptism makes perfect sense. This is why the early church had no problem with infant baptism, because they saw infant baptism as being paralleled, and the same theology that makes circumcision work makes infant baptism work. Now, just to emphasize even more that circumcision was supposed to be a spiritual act, and now let's look at Romans chapter 2, verse 28 to 29. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 to 29. There, Paul says, a man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. So Paul, when he was talking and looking at circumcision, does not see it as some outdated, old-fashioned, Old Testament idea that he throws away and replaces with baptism. He sees baptism as the fulfillment and the continuation of the very same theology of circumcision. The great thing about baptism is it has even more ideas within it. For example, it's applied to not just the men, but it's applied to the men and the women. It's an idea that reminds us not only of the washing away of the old, but it's as if we're being buried with Christ and raised to new life. And just for a moment, if you can turn back to Colossians chapter 2, verse 11 and 12 again for a moment, especially in verse 12. When you were buried, and then the other verb that shows up, you were also raised with him. There's a difference between an active verb and a passive verb. An active verb is something that I am doing. A passive verb is something that is done to me. Notice that buried and raised are both passive verbs. I am not burying myself. A dead person does not bury themselves. Raised. I am not raising myself. A dead person does not raise themselves. It is an outward power that does both of these things. Now it makes even more sense why we give this sign to a helpless infant. It's so clear that this infant has no power to bury themselves nor raise themselves. All glory, all honor goes to God alone, not to the child, and not even to the parents. We as parents are just saying that we know of this God who is so good. That's it. And so moving forward then, baptism becomes the new covenant sign and seal. If the circumcision is the sign and seal of the old covenant, then the new covenant is signed and sealed by way of baptism. It shows us and the world that God sent his son. Before we loved him, he first loved us, right? There's several other verses that we can pull out that emphasize God's primary work in our lives. That's what baptism affirms. We accept the faithfulness of God as our starting point in our relationship with God. Now, this is why in the Marthoma Church, we baptize infants of those who profess their faith. That is, the parents need to profess faith. What do you do if the parents are not professing their faith? Well, you can go to the grandparents. As long as there is a community that is willing to raise this child, then that means there is an awareness of the God who loves this child. And that awareness is being declared, right? And this is why the godparent, as the representative of this covenant head, they declare their own faith, right? In that statement, I who am being baptized, right? They hold the child's hand and then they say that I who am being baptized. That statement, it's not us transferring our faith onto the child. Please don't misunderstand. This is us declaring that we are a community that knows that there is a God who first loved us. And this is why it's, this is why we do it in this way. Let's look at this whole thing from a different angle for a moment. If we go for a moment, not that I agree with it, but if for a moment you take the adult baptism sort of definition of baptism, which is that baptism is an outward expression of inward faith. I think every adult baptism proponent would be very fine with that definition, that baptism is an outward expression of inward faith. Then let's ask a couple of key questions that we should ask. That is this: when a person declares their faith, praise God that they are able to, what was God doing in the moment before the individual comes to faith? What was God up to? Well, if we're humble, we'll say that definitely God was working in that person to enable them to express their faith. And in fact, I'm sure that we would say that God's work is essential in that person expressing their faith. Okay, let's press the question a little further. When did God start this essential work? Well, he didn't start it just yesterday. He didn't start it just last year. If we're very faithful, I think we can say that God was working on this individual from the day they were born and from before they were born. And this is a biblically true statement. In Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, we understand that before I was born, while I was in my mother's womb, these ideas that God knew me, that he was working and planning in and through all generations, and that his work is essential. So then here's the question that we end with. As an adult baptizing community, when do we acknowledge that God first loved us? It seems as though in an adult baptizing community, the first declaration is of the individual declaration of faith. But the individual declaration of faith is not the thing that saves us. It's God's grace. When do we acknowledge that? Well, so in some of these churches, they understand the difficulty here. And so what they'll do is they'll quickly insert a new function, and they'll call it an infant dedication. And so in many of the adult baptism churches, you'll find infant dedications are available. But then what is an infant dedication? Is it not a sacrament? Is it not an experience of God's grace Do we dare make it less than our declaration of faith? In the Marthoma Church and in most of the churches around the world, we start with God's faithfulness. In our church, when do we acknowledge our expression of faith? First communion. First communion is when a child or an adult declares before the community that by God's grace, because he first loved me, I am able to stand before you all and say that I love him. And so that's how the process and the journey of our sacraments works in our lives. And moreover, when we give baptism to an infant, are we saying that that infant is saved? No, we're not. There are plenty of examples that we have in the Bible that show that those who were circumcised were no better than those who were uncircumcised. Does that mean that circumcision is a wrong act to do? Does that mean that circumcision is useless? No. What it means is that there were a lot of people who didn't live up to the meaning that the circumcision should have had in their lives. In the New Testament, we have a similar example of a person named Simon Magus in Acts chapter 8. Simon, a magician, requests to be baptized. He says that he confesses and believes, but then later on, when he sees the disciples performing miracles, he turns around and says, hey, I'll give you, how much does this cost? I'll give you whatever it is. Give me this power so that whoever I lay my hands on can be healed as well. Right? He thought this was a new magic trick that he could add to his routine, to which the disciples told him, you've missed it completely. And Peter would say that you are bound in chains of wickedness, as like a typical language that's used for an unconverted person. But he received baptism. Does that mean that baptism is a worthless gesture that doesn't do what it says it's supposed to do? No, it just meant that there was a community that declared God's faithfulness, but Simon didn't live up to it. Simon failed to enjoy the blessings of growing in that covenant relationship with God. And so this makes us realize that baptism, though it's an action, it is a one-time action. It is a lifelong initiation into our faith. This is why when we come for another child's baptism, every time we have a baptism, I'll always tell the community, read the prayers. These were the prayers that were said when you were a child, right? You have to remember them and you have to continue to grow and live in them. There's never a day in our lives when we will wake up and say, I do not need to remove the old flesh, that I am perfectly fine as I am. Every day, there is still more that needs to be buried. And every day, there's still more that needs to be raised to new life through Christ in our lives. And so just like communion is an ongoing action, the meaning of baptism needs to be continued on throughout our lives. Why don't we do baptisms every Sunday then? Well, that's because we remember what baptism represents. Baptism is God first loves us. This is why it doesn't make sense to do a second baptism. I know that some people are so enthusiastic to do it and to experience it, and God bless them in their journey of faith. But what's being said? Oftentimes, what's being said is, I'm declaring my faith. And if that's the case, then I agree with them. You should get baptized every day, right? Because every day you need to declare your faith to God. Every day you need to make that recommitment. But if baptism really is actually about God's faithfulness, it only needs to be said one time. It only needs to be said one time. And if you say it again, it's as if the first time didn't count, or as if you're changing the statement a little. So that's why we're very careful to teach it clearly and then ask people to maintain in that faithfulness. One last thing before we open it up for questions. Jesus was baptized as an adult, wasn't he? Is the baptism of John the Baptist the same as the baptism in the name of the triune God? The answer is no, they're not the same. The baptism of John the Baptist is not a baptism into the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. The baptism of John the Baptist was simply a symbol of being washed clean of our sins, a symbol of forgiveness, a symbol that Christ chose to bear as our representative, right? And again, it also just foreshadows that even though this Abrahamic covenant will be, the consequences of it will be borne by Christ alone, there is already forgiveness. There's already that acceptance by God. Even in that moment, the cloud opens and says, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." What did Jesus do up at that point? His ministry had not yet begun. Again, it's God first loves us. And then we must live out in our lives this kind of relationship with God. So don't confuse those two. And then in the New Testament, when you see several cases of adult baptism, know that this is just like the case of Abraham, where you don't have a community of faith. And so you need a covenant head to take the role of saying, I believe. But then after that, as you see in the Bible, there are cases where whole families, one believes and the whole family is baptized. Right? Again, it's same concept as the circumcision in the Old Testament. So knowing this framework, I hope will help us to have a better appreciation for what baptism is, how it's grounded in the Old Testament, and why the Marthoma Church, a Bible-centered church, chooses to follow in this tradition. So we'll pause at this moment, and then we'll take any questions.